We are inundated with comments and questions. I have so many myself, but I'm going to suppress my intentions and go straight to the questions and comments from our viewers. If that's okay with you, Bronwyn, we'll just dive straight in. One question there actually is one that I had wondered as well, which is, are constitutional changes possible to legally protect future generations? And I suppose within that, where you have a referendum to change the constitution, should younger people be part of voting, if it comes to that? But a question there about the constitutional changes. Do you think they're possible?
Yes, constitutional changes are very possible. We're seeing them around the world. They're used extensively in South America to protect environmental rights. We've seen this, the Scotland example of including young people in the vote for the referendum. But again, constitutional changes needs these conversations. They need us to support them. A constitution, whether it's written down or whether it's informal as in New Zealand, they are still evolving in live documents. So it matters that people really understand and feel that this represents them. We talk about them as anchoring things because they are important points in the ground. So the Paris Climate Agreement was an important moment in time as well, that set the 1.5 and the 2 degrees as warming. It becomes a new reference point, but we need to keep making this real by making it real in everyday practice.
And would you agree that where a referendum has to happen, then it becomes essential in that regard that younger people are given a vote within that?
Yes, I do. And I forgot to say that, of course, one of the most obvious ways in which the community and young people are involved is citizen assemblies, which Ireland has led. That's the most obvious part, as I was saying far too much in a short amount of time. So the citizens assemblies approach is evolving, and it's the ways in which we can create spaces for young people to be seen. So the difficulty with referenda is that they are very blunt. They're usually an either or choice. So you need that thoughtful conversation first to get that nuance, because communities are very different. The views of young people in older and across rural and urban communities are very different. So it's not just the referenda that matters, it's the conversation that precedes those votes that is essential, and then comes after.
A comment here, excellent lecture. Thank you very much. What are your thoughts regarding the Minister for Future Generations in Wales? Is it an effective tool? This is, of course, Derek Walker, and Wales is the only country in the world with a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But your thoughts on the Minister for Future Generations, because obviously this is one way that governments can have some acknowledgement and some nod to younger people and what they're going to face.
Yes, actually, there are several countries who are now developing or have ministers for future generations, and we're in the middle of developing a proposal for that as well. I do think that it is one tool. I think it's an important tool because, again, it's just a moment in which you have an opportunity to pause and think about the longer term. So it's a check, it's a balance. It's not the silver bullet. It has to be several things together, but I think it is a very important step. Again, for us, to make that Ministry of Future Generations work, we have a commission for the environment already, but we have a children's commission, but that future generations will have to work around our Treaty of Waitangi. We'll have to think about how that works. So we're having a very similar conversation to Ireland. I think there are very many strengths and reasons to have that. It's not the whole solution, but it's a very important part of the solution. Very important.
Another question, how can we translate these? You mentioned the surveys and the strongly pro-climate beliefs in the EPA surveys. A question here, how can we translate these strongly pro-climate beliefs among Irish people into actual action and political change? I suppose that is the fundamental overarching question of all and of everything to do with climate change. But any thoughts on that? I mean, obviously, intention and opinion is one thing, but action is completely separate in many ways.
And here many of my behavioral psychologist colleagues would hop in, but I would say from a politics point of view, conversation is essential. We kind of underestimate how important it is. Like when we're trying to convince people to vote in certain ways, we know that you have to have 3 conversations with 3 trusted people and maybe 6 before you actually change your traditional vote to something new. You need to have it in different ways. So it's important to at the moment when we are often isolated and just receiving huge amounts of loosely coordinated social media disinformation and denial. There's a major study coming out at lunchtime, my time, midnight yours, about this disinformation that we're experiencing in climate and environmental sciences at the moment, and how it's kind of linked now through social media on steroids. We've known it, but this study that's about to come out is looking more carefully at how it's actually happening. So that makes it more important when people are hearing one message on all their social media and every time they open their phone, actually having conversations with real people who are saying, well, I am a bit worried about this. I'm at least worried about my tax. I'm worried about flooding. I'm worried about the water quality. Those conversations are essential for motivating action. Because actually, when you see that other people like me are worried, then that helps feed, and then provide the opportunities to take that action. And that helps shift worry to action. So provide ways in which people can engage that are perhaps not overwhelming. People are very time poor, but let people we often dismiss the very small steps, but those very small steps with other people in your local communities that are successes build success. So don't underestimate those local council changes.
I just wonder, some young people might say that they can't talk about the climate with their parents or their grandparents. When they do, the conversation might be shut down, might be closed down. Maybe the parent is uncomfortable about talking about it. I wonder how we can better support parents to be able to support their own children.
Yes, we know, and the Irish Mind study shows that as well, that younger people are obviously thinking about it a lot more worried than older, but actually it's the 35 to 45-year-olds are also feeling particularly, oh, I'm okay. Well, actually, we're not. You're not. So for young, I would say there is a really important role here for churches, sports clubs, whether it's football, coaches, for choir leaders, when we see how disinformation spreads, we also see how positive information spreads. So think about working with communities where older people are actually able to have that conversation with someone they trust as well. Intergenerational conversations matter, but a lot of people, I think, feel a lot of guilt. Actually, you don't want to think about what we're creating because it is so horrendous. So find ways in which you're working with others that people trust, who are intermediaries, who have a different conversation. So think about your knitting groups, your choirs, all sorts of ways in which you have those conversations with different communities.
A question, a comment, that was amazing. Thank you. That's to you, Bronwyn. Can you speak about your thoughts regarding the high focus on STEM education across countries to address issues such as climate change and how they might fold in some of the models you spoke about, like the SEEDS model? Thank you.
I'm really worried about the STEM focus. I'll try not to say anything very political about the reform of our curriculum that's happening here or maybe happening here in New Zealand, but I was surprised to be one of the first political scientists on the IPCC. And initially there was a lot of, oh, well, I remember getting quite a few sort of criticisms about, well, why do we need politics involved? But these decisions are deeply political. We need psychologists. We need creative artists. We need storytellers. We need people who are understanding and thinking about politics, because actually it's what we do now as people that matters. We've created this problem. Now the storytellers, the people who can help with our emotional responses, the people who can support us to work collectively together are vital. And so my very sincere worry is that if we leave climate change to the science of it is vital that we get the science right. But in a classroom situation, just talking about how we lower emissions is not connecting with the moral questions that the school strike movement was so powerful at bringing to the fore. I mean, they shifted this conversation from a very technical one to around the world, it suddenly was a moral one. What's fair about the future? And they might feel like they're not winning or making any difference, but that has been a tremendous shift in a very short period of time, that this is something suddenly that families can talk about. Like, what is fair for the future? And those are questions that are much bigger than the technical issues. We need that technical science, but we need these other ways of the skills that we draw from humanities, creative arts, and social sciences as well to solve these problems.
I presume that gets to the heart of the idea that it is not just data, a Wikipedia entry of data that will change hearts and minds. It is emotion in many ways that will help move people and shift people and the way they think.
Yes, because it's not even, I mean, some of the research is showing it's not even experience. Like, uh, we've been through massive earthquakes here, and you know, within a decade, I'm forgetting like that the
Mm.
bookcase that is behind me, behind this, that could easily come down on me. I'm not sure that it's you know, I've bolted it to the wall. So even experience is not enough. We need to think constantly about how we maintain this long-term thinking, the changes that we need. Uh, yeah, so that hasn't really answered your question there, Ella, sorry, but
There's a
yeah.
comment here, a comment more than a question, from someone who says, I manage the education and youth programme at the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. When Bronwyn talks about the Leva Youth Participation Guide, I'm reminded of the Irish Schools Sustainability Network's work, and particularly their Student Ambassador programme, which is inclusive, student-led, action-orientated, leading to the full participation and transformative learning, which is what we need to tackle the crises. I just wonder within that, I know the Irish School Sustainability Network is looking at the curriculum and the need to radically shift the curriculum in order to respond to emerging needs. Would you agree, Bronwyn, that that is what is needed in terms of education systems around the world?
Yes, but I think it would be a huge shame if we shift our curriculum just to deal with climate. I mean, one of the things is that climate is a driver of this, but for climate scientists, I don't want to be sacrilegious, but we actually have to put climate back in its box. People have aspirations, joy, aims, and ambitions. Climate's getting in the way of them. So they don't want to talk about climate. But as I've learned from a community just around the corner, actually, they want to talk about flooded sports fields, which are getting in the way of their children's ability to compete in national competitions for rugby. I had never thought that rugby fields would be the way in which we would have conversations about climate. In our school curriculum, we need ways in which we are supporting eventually transdisciplinary thinking, the connecting across all our silos. But students still need to build skills, they still need to be able to solve immediate problems. Climate change, though, is one of the big issues that they will need to be tackling in their lives. So, having confidence about how you work with others to solve problems is almost, and how you do that humbly, recognizing you don't know all of the answers. Those are kind of the soft skills that are also really essential. So at the moment, with our curriculums really coming so tight, focused so definitely on testing and on STEM, we have got a real problem, because that kind of soft skill, emotional and problem solving is pushed to the side. So yes, we need a radical change, but it is not just for climate. It's to achieve all the things that our children need to flourish.
Another question here. It's curious to me that the discourse still remains so heavily weighted towards the perspective of the 55 plus generation. I am 43, and my best friend, my age, and younger brother, who's 38, and his wife, who's 32, welcomed infants this summer. Your imagined scenario is the lived experience of billions of parents, aunts, uncles, etc. right now. This isn't an imaginary far off issue. We, as a collective body of adults with power, resources, and responsibility to younger generations, are already failing every day to prepare the future of the young people we are already raising. Why do you think this part of the discourse doesn't seem to penetrate?
I think it is beginning to penetrate. I was just thinking, I think it's, is it Professor Dr. Gold? Is it from in Ireland and Dublin, who's been working on parenting as a moment of change.
Mm.
Kate Birmingham at Surrey University has been thinking about parenting, and my colleague Kate Prendergast here in New Zealand. When you're parenting, there's a lot going on. You haven't got a lot of money, you haven't got a lot of time, you haven't had a lot of sleep, you've got enormous pressure and expectation, you're on a journey that you weren't expecting, there's a lot happening, and then you're worrying about your child's future. So that's where I think that intergenerational, the support of the 55-year-olds for that parenting leadership is important, but that leadership of parenting is really vital. Like, it's that energy that will make a difference, but it's finding as a parent, you're time poor and often resource poor, so finding ways to be able to connect with other parents to push for change is different. You need a different set of ways of collaborating, and I would say watch this space. I think, yes, it is hard, but we are seeing really a growing number of parents who are really starting to think about, if they are embarking on becoming parents, what difference is this going to make? How am I going to make sure that children that I love, and even if they're not parents, if they're aunties, cousins, uncles, that children that they love are going to be supported into the future. So finding the way that we can engage with that age group, but certainly the Irish Mind study suggests that you're competing against a kind of feeling that there are other issues that are immediately pressing. But parenting is a moment of change. It's how we sustain it. That doesn't answer the question, I'm sorry.
I'd be interested to know if there's any state obligation to educate and inform the population about the coming impacts of climate change. For example, threats to public health, implications for children, malnutrition, etc. I find it shocking how little public communication there has been, especially targeted at parents, compared to the clear and constant communications in relation to the pandemic, in relation to public health. I think that's something, Bronwyn, that was quite striking to anyone working in the climate space, that when it came to COVID, there was a very successful and remarkably quick campaign of communication, and unrelenting campaign of communication to make sure those messages, those important messages, were sent and received. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's one of the things that the Summit for the Future, the UN meeting, was focused on too, about how do we make this same sense of urgency, this constant communication. I mean, we have the stock market index every day. We have a weather report, but we don't have this, where are we, how are we progressing? We do know that if cities share their information regularly and constantly in the newspaper, in a little quarterly report on how are we progressing, what was our baseline, where are we going, just like countries, that makes a difference. So 24 countries have been able to sustain their emissions reductions for over a decade. And those countries all have independent monitoring and communication teams who are both monitoring what's happening and reporting. So giving that feedback to people makes a huge difference. The trouble is that this is long-term thinking. So it is not an immediate and pressing issue now, like a pandemic. Unless you're in a flood, unless you're in a fire, unless you're in a hurricane, climate seems like it's change, seems like it's something into the distance. So using those lessons of constant communication, of monitoring, is really important and helpful.
There's a question here, we can roll two into one, which is, do you have any ideas how to bridge the disconnect between the awareness of the impact of climate change on future generations and the reluctance to take steps to actually manage climate mitigation? If it is not a knowledge gap, what is it?
I watched in our synthesis report when 196 governments have to approve line by line every statement of the summary. And so there's always a battle for the wording of those. They all approved and voted that we need more political will. And I thought, okay, so you've all said you need the political will, but that's actually you. Now, I think I mentioned about noise at the beginning. It can feel really impossible to affect change, but Ireland and New Zealand have some natural advantages. We're relatively small democracies, quite closely connected. We have relatively central systems of making decisions. So actually, you can contact your MPs, you can contact your local MPs. Making your connections doesn't just have to be through protest. It's making it known constantly over in lots of different ways, and then supporting leaders and community activists and actions that are making a difference, because it can be very lonely for people who are trying to step out and speak up. So support them. We don't have to criticize everything. Don't make the great the enemy of the good. If we can see some progress, support it, celebrate it. And I think also Ireland is extremely important and will be from a soft diplomacy point of view. It has an extremely influential role in both international relations and particularly, for example, with the US and in the development of the Ukraine. So messages and stories and ways in which Ireland talks about climate have a much bigger effect than perhaps Ireland even really understands. It's a very influential small country, not that small.
Friends of the Earth is another question. Friends of the Earth did an analysis of the manifestos of each of the political parties in terms of climate. The parties that came out as having some of the weakest climate policies got the biggest share of the vote. The message still isn't landing in a way that motivates people to take action. How can we grow public awareness in a meaningful way to ensure that parents are voting with their children's future in mind? And how can policy support this? I mean, these are very big questions. I suppose it's also, Bronwyn, not only parents voting with their children's future in mind, but it's also grandparents, isn't it?
And I think that as political scientists, we need to do a lot more work here, because I think you can't blame voters for not voting for climate, because actually the Irish exit polls were showing that people were still worried about climate as they leave that room. So I think for climate scientists, this is why I say we need to put climate almost back in its box and think about the related co-benefits of achieving what it is that communities are immediately worried about: affordable housing, the issues of flood risk, those issues that are really pressing for communities that you know about. You will know what those issues are. How have they got climate resonance? So it's shifting, making sure that we are always acting in a co-benefit way, so that we're giving space for politicians to take action, because we are also very swift to judge. So a politician who is acting in a way that we don't expect them to, and think about a politician who has campaigned not on climate, who actually probably feels morally uncomfortable about some of these issues, would be maybe very concerned about flooding. Well, think about creating space where we can take actions that have benefits. They may not be labeled climate actions, but they have huge climate co-benefits. It's frustrating, but it is working collectively as a whole.
I get a sense, I don't know whether I'm picking this up incorrectly, that there may almost be a lingo fatigue here about the term climate change. It's too easy to ignore it when you hear it, for parents to say, I just don't want to be part of that, I don't want to hear it, it's too negative. But also in terms of politicians who, as you say, may take actions, but not necessarily want to talk clearly about climate change per se.
And it's very frustrating. It's extremely frustrating for climate scientists who research for such a long time. I want to talk about this. But I remember being very struck about 8 years ago at my first climate meeting. A communicator said, "Why are you all talking about greenhouse gases? 90% of the world has never seen a greenhouse and has no idea what you're talking about. Why don't you call them heat trapping gases?" And I think from then I just started thinking, yeah, let's start where people are. So start with what it is that matters in your community and how does that make a difference for the climate.
We're coming to the end, Bronwyn. I'm very mindful of the time. One final question. How do you avoid feeling overwhelmed by negative climate change information? How do you avoid feeling overwhelmed, full stop? I mean, the space, as you say, can be uncomfortable.
Feel extremely overwhelmed often. But this is why I think the sense of self-transcendence is so vital. For me, I had never expected what it would be like to belong to a community of thousands of scientists working. And in my biggest despair moments, it's that sense that there are actually thousands of people. And when we're collectively working, there are millions of us. And for young people today, I'm terribly worried about the enormous pressure we put on individual action. That is the recipe for burnout. It's the feeling that actually, as the wonderful Professor Bullard, who's the father of environmental justice, says, this is not a race. Fixing the climate and the environment is not even a marathon. It's a relay marathon across generations run by teams. So feeling that you are part of something that is bigger than yourself, that it takes constant struggle, but it is not always for you. And Ben Bowman, a lovely political researcher in the UK, argues, find that joy in working with others. That joy and that fulfillment of doing things with other people, for other people, lifts you. Rather than pressing children to solve the problems that we have created, let's support them with communities around them so that they can live flourishing lives and can learn the skills to work collaboratively to bring change.
Well, on that very hopeful and positive note, we're going to draw this evening to a close. Bronwyn, thank you very much for joining us from New Zealand. We are very grateful for your insights and your participation this evening, and you've left us with an awful lot to think about.